In this video, we'll talk about AJAX, which combines JavaScript with asynchronous HTTP request so we can communicate with a server in the background. This hides a network delay and makes user interaction with a web application a lot more enjoyable. We talked about moving functionality from server to client to improve user experience and reduce server workload. With JavaScript, we can handle all kinds of events and implement lots of functions on the client side. But there's one thing that still makes web applications feel less responsive than desktop applications, and that's network delay. Doing things with JavaScript in a browser is great, but at some point the application has to talk to a server, either getting some data from the server or saving some data to the server. And then the user feels a network delay. For example, when you submit a form, if your network or server is slow, you'll feel that the submit button freezes for some time, and the interaction with the application no longer feels smooth. The problem is that when we use browser to submit HTTP requests to a server, the browser uses the so-called synchronous request-response model. What this means is that the browser will send a request and then wait until the response comes back before it allows you to do anything. The time between sending a request and getting back a response is determined not just by how fast your internet connection is, but also how fast the server can process a request. If your connection is slow or the server is busy, interacting with a web application will feel very sluggish. The solution people came up with is something called XML HTTP request. It's a JavaScript object, so basically you can create a HTTP request in JavaScript and send it out. What makes it special is that you can handle the response asynchronously, meaning the code doesn't have to wait there until the response comes back. So what exactly does that mean? Well, let's look at this code. On the left-hand side is how synchronous code works. We send out a request. The send request method will not return until the response comes back. And after send request method returns, which means the response has come back, we can process the response and then we can do other things. The problem here is that everything has to wait until the send request method returns, which can take some time due to slow network or slow server. On the right-hand side, we have the asynchronous approach, where send request method returns as soon as it sends out the request. In other words, it doesn't wait for the response. But immediately you can see a problem. If send request returns without a response, process response will run into an error because response will be null at this point. So the real asynchronous programming code looks like this. Send request indeed returns as soon as the request is sent. And then the code can go ahead and do other things that are not related to the response. So the application won't freeze like before. Of course, we still need to process the response when it comes back, and the code that processes the response is moved out of the main flow and into a callback function. A callback function is basically an event handler. When you do GUI programming, for example, you may have a button, but you don't know when that button will be clicked. So you write a click event handler and say, when the button is clicked, run this event handler. A response callback function is just like that. It's an event handler that handles the response coming back event. Now let's see an example of how XML HTTP request works. So I have an HTML page here. If you ignore the JavaScript part, for now you can see that the HTML part is very simple. We say some random number, and then we have a span element which shows 0.1, and then we have a button, and the button has a unclick event handler. And without doing anything, this is what the page would look like, and we can see that it displays 0.1, and of course there's an event handler. This is the client-side part, and then we also have a server-side part, which is just a simple servlet. If you look at this servlet, you can see that it's very simple. What it does is it basically just generates a random number and then send back the random number in the response just as a text response. There's no HTML tag or anything else, just a random number itself as plain text. Very simple servlet, nothing else, just a couple of lines. So the trick, of course, is inside the event handler. So what happens when we click on the event handler? Well, the event handler will create a XML HTTP request. And this XML HTTP request will have an event handler of its own, which is basically the callback function that will handle the response when it comes back. So once we attach this callback function to it, we can send this request to this URL. By the way, this is a URL, it's not just a string. And that URL matches the URL of the servlet. Or in other words, this one will send a GET request to this URL. And of course, the servlet will respond by sending back a random number. Now, once we get back that random number, we will set it to the inner text of the span element, which is here. So this is why if I click on this button, it will get a random number, and this random number is in fact a random number sent back from the servlet or from the server side. And if I click again, I get another number, and so on. So this code, this example is pretty simple, but it showcases all the important elements of XML HTTP request operation, where a client script will send a XML HTTP request, and a server-side program will receive the request and respond by sending some data back. And when the response comes back to the client, a callback function is invoked, and using that response to update the document. And in this case, it will update the span element to show the random number sent back from the server side. So this is how we can send a HTTP request in JavaScript and process the response asynchronously. We kind of gloss over the details because it's somewhat complicated. And if you want to have a better understanding of the code, here is the API of XML HTTP request. But as we'll see in a moment, jQuery makes doing this a lot easier. Generally speaking, you'll never use XML HTTP request without a library, like in this example. So the details here are not very important. So what is AJAX then? You'll probably have heard of it before in the context of web development. The term AJAX, which stands for Asynchronous, JavaScript, and XML, was made up by a web designer who used the term to describe a set of technologies used to create more interactive and more responsive web applications. The original AJAX article mentioned several technologies, but it really comes down to JavaScript and XML HTTP request. The two defining characteristics of AJAX are, first, send an XML HTTP request in the background and handle the response asynchronously. This does not block any user interaction with the page, so the user doesn't feel the network delay. And second, once the response comes back, use JavaScript to update part of the web page instead of reloading the whole page. Usually there's a delay when reloading a whole page and you see a flicker on your screen, but updating part of the page does not have that problem, which makes the UI seems more smooth. Here's a little bit more background about AJAX. XML HTTP request started out as an Internet Explorer specific feature that only Microsoft used in some of their web applications. Because it was really a good idea, Mozilla added it to Firefox, and later Google used it to create Google Map. When Google Map first came out, it was shocking to people that a web application could be so smooth and responsive as if it was a desktop application. Later, people figured out Google Maps use AJAX, and all of a sudden, a whole bunch of libraries and frameworks were developed to support AJAX operations, and lots of web applications started to use AJAX. That started the so-called Web 2.0. If you talk about technologies that change the web, AJAX is certainly near the top of the list. Before we implement some AJAX operations, let's first define what an AJAX operation is. We talked about client-side JavaScript before, but just doing some JavaScript on a web page is not AJAX. Remember, JavaScript is the JA in AJAX, but there are also A and X. An AJAX operation has to be an operation that involves communicating with the server, and the communication is done using XML HTTP request and asynchronous response processing. After the response is processed, there's typically a partial update of the web page to show the result of the operation. XML HTTP request is the name of the JavaScript object used to send the request and process the response. Note that it is not some special request. The HTTP request sent through XML HTTP request is just a regular HTTP request. What this means is that the server side doesn't need to do anything special to handle a request sent by XML HTTP request. Everything we learned about request handling still applies. And this is why in this example, the server side is really just a simple servlet, nothing special. So XML HTTP request is very useful, but as we can see in this example, using it has the same problems as using plain JavaScript. There are browser compatibility issues, and the code is quite verbose and tedious. And of course, jQuery comes to the rescue again. And this is the same example using jQuery. So if we go to number 2.html, we can see that it works exactly the same as the one before. However, if you look at the code, you can see that this is all it takes to write jQuery code to implement the same function, comparing to all this non-jQuery code. So you can check out the documentation and see all the properties used in this jQuery AJAX method. We should talk a little bit about the jQuery AJAX method first. So in this example, instead of using plain XML HTTP requests and all the other JavaScript code, plain JavaScript code, like in the previous example, we're using jQuery, and the jQuery provides a method called AJAX. You can just call it using $.ajax, and there are two ways to call this method. If we take a look at the documentation very quickly. So the first way to call it is to specify the URL as a separate argument, and then another object specify all the settings that we want to use to customize the request and handle the response. Another way is simply just using one object, and this object has a URL property, which is the URL where we are going to send the request to. So that URL property is this. So in other words, we can specify URL either as a separate argument or as part of the settings object. I typically just use the second form so that I don't need to specify a second argument, basically. And so this settings object has lots of properties, as you can see. Here are the important ones. So the URL property, as shown here, is the URL of the server-side program that will respond to this request. And you can use the method property to specify whether the request should be a get request or post request, and some other or some other request methods like put, delete, patch, and so on. And data is an object that you can use to send parameters to the server side. And there are a bunch of other properties. There are two types of properties in settings. One type, like URL method data, are value properties. You give them a value. And then there are some properties, function properties, and their values are functions or callback functions. For example, success is a function property. You need to provide a function to this property. What this means is that if the operation is successful, this function will be called. As you can see, in this case, when the request is successful, the response data will be passed to this callback function, and then we simply use that to update the content of the number element, which is this element. And if some error happens, you can provide an error callback function that will be run when an error happens. So knowing what we know, it's actually already enough to create some AJAX operations. And once again, we come back to our Guestbook example, and we'll change it so that instead of having one page to display Guestbook and one page for adding comments, everything will happen on the same page. And furthermore, instead of using asynchronous requests and getting a new page after each operation, we'll use AJAX operations to communicate with the server and update the same page. So let's do that. And let me stop the server, close this, and we'll create a new project. And we'll call it Guestbook AJAX. Okay, probably should have done this before I start recording. And I already have my Guestbook JDBC here, so we'll copy over some code. Let me create a folder. Excuse me. We'll create a package called model, and we'll copy over Guestbook entry. And we'll create a package called 3220 service. And we'll copy over the service class. And we'll also copy over a couple of controllers. So servant, and we'll copy over add, delete, and guestbook. Okay, so we'll copy over one more thing, which is the initial page showing all the guestbook entries. And let's copy over guestbook JSP, and should be under webinf, so let's put it under webinf. Okay, so let's run this. Okay, so it works. That's great, meaning that I can talk to the database and I can get the data here. Now, we are going to make some changes. So we're going to add a form here so that we can add entries directly. And let's do that first. So I'll add another row here, and I'm going to give this row an ID because later on we'll need to insert something before this row. So let's give it an ID, and then we'll have TD, and it will have an input box. The name is name. And then we'll have another TD, we'll have another input box, and the name will be called message. And if we refresh here, we can see, okay, so we'll need that button. So let's add a button and call add. Okay, so now we have our form, and then I want to change this part and put in some delete buttons. We are going to use click handlers, so we'll make them delete buttons. And here, instead of this, I'll have a button called delete. Okay, so to distinguish between add and delete, I'm going to give this one a class called delete, so that later on we can pick out the delete buttons instead of picking out all the buttons. Okay, so this is pretty much what my page will look like. We'll add a little bit more later, but this is good for now. Oh, and I no longer need this link. Okay, so the AJAX operation all happens on this page. We are not going to load a second page. Whenever a user enters something and click add, we'll simply send a AJAX request in the background, and then when the response comes back, we update the table accordingly without loading a new page. Same thing when we click a delete button, we will send a request to the server to delete it from the server, and then remove this row. And just to make sure that we are indeed deleting it from the server, let me quickly log into my database and make sure that it's actually deleting things. So we have O'Brien, O'Malley, ASD, and we have O'Brien, O'Malley, ASD. Okay, so this is indeed from the database. Okay, so first things first, let's get the jQuery library. So we'll grab this one from here, and we'll put it here, and then here we'll start writing our own script, and we'll say function, and then something. So let's say we start by implementing delete first. This one is a bit easier than add. So we want to say, let's select all the delete buttons. Since I gave them a class called delete, I'll use a class selector to select them, and then I'll give it a click event handler. And what we want to do here is we want to send a request to the delete controller to delete the entry with the given ID. Now, here there's a problem. Now, if we look at the delete code, we'll need an ID in order to delete it. But here, in this JavaScript code, we don't have an ID. Now, we do have an ID in the Guestbook entry, and we do have an ID here. However, if you look at the web page, we are not using that ID anywhere, which means that our delete callback function or delete event handler will not be able to get the ID and tell the server to delete it. So the first thing we need to do is to add the ID somewhere so that we can get it. Now, so this is the first new thing is, if you remember in HTML5, we can create our own attributes, and these attributes typically are used for JavaScript coding purposes. And these user-defined attributes start with data dash and then whatever afterwards. So one thing we can do is we can add that attribute somewhere. Let's say we add the attribute data entry ID to each row, and this one will have the entry ID. Now, if we look at the result, let me put it in here. If we look at the source code, now we have the ID. The first row has a data ID, entry ID of 5, which is indeed this one. And the second row has a data entry ID of 6, which is this one. So we now have the entry ID in the web page, and then we need to be able to get it. And this class selector will select each delete button, and then we need to go from this delete button to this tr element and get the data entry ID from this tr element. So this is the second thing we need to look at, is the so-called DOM traversal capabilities provided by jQuery. If you remember, DOM traversal in jQuery means that you use the elements you selected to get to other elements, their children or their parents or their ancestors, descendants, and so on. So you started with some selected elements and then get more by traversing the DOM tree. And the method we are going to use is this closest method, which will find the first element that matches the selector from the selected element. And so what we'll say is something like this. We'll say, give me the row of this delete button, and this row should be the closest tr. And with this row, we'll have the ID, and the ID will be the rows attr, and the name of the attribute is data entry ID. Now, to make sure this part works, let's print out ID and see if we are indeed getting the ID. So we'll refresh, and we'll open up the developer tools. So let me, yes. So if I click this button, it shows 5. Click this button, it shows 6. So that means we are indeed getting the ID. So that's great. So once we know that, then the next part is easy. So we then will send the AJAX request. And the AJAX request, the URL will be this URL. So it will be delete entry. And the data will be ID, so it will send a request parameter ID, and if this request is successful, we are going to remove this row. So this is pretty much what the delete would look like. And if we look at the controller, we can see that it will get the ID from request parameter, and it will do a DB service delete entry, which is great. And previously, it will redirect to another page, but now we don't need it to redirect to another page because it's an AJAX request that happens behind the scene, we don't want to redirect. We want to actually stay on the same page. So all it needs to do is just return an empty response, and that means it doesn't need to do anything. Once get finishes, it will return an empty response, and that's it. So this is going to be the server-side code, pretty much the same as before, minus the redirect part. So let's run this, and I'm going to refresh, and I'm going to delete. Doesn't seem to work. Let me do it here. Okay, so this one works, and if we check here, we can see that O'Brien was indeed deleted, and let's delete ASD, we'll delete ASD, and so ASD is indeed deleted. So now we have completed our first AJAX operation, and as you can see, the code is actually not too difficult. The trick is we need to have a way to get the ID and then send an AJAX request to the server side, and if the request is successful, we will remove this table row using JavaScript without refreshing the page. So I think it seems to be complaining about this one. How about we give it the full syntax? Okay, so now it's okay. And let me refresh and delete mat, and oh yeah, so that syntax was actually correct, but I guess Eclipse doesn't like it. Okay, so now we have delete, and let's do add. So what happens with add, of course, is that we want to click this button and add whatever user put in here to the database. So that means I probably would better to give this ID, so it's easier to select that button. So I'm going to select that button using the ID selector, and I will say function. So if this button is clicked, we'll get the name. So name should be whatever the value of this element. So we'll do input name is name selector, and we'll select the value of that, and let's also select the name as a message, and this one is message. Again, let's make sure this part works by printing out the name and the message first. So and then we'll say John says hi and add. It's not getting the value. Oh, I missed this one. And for some reason, this one is not giving me name either. Let me see. John says hi. So we're not getting name and message. Is it because I'm not doing the selector correctly? So I'm getting input with a name attribute that has a value called name. I should get this. Well, the easiest way is to give it an ID, and we use ID selector and see if that fix our problem. So this one will be selecting ID by ID, and this one will be selecting by ID. And let's refresh, and John says hi. Still not giving me anything. So why am I not getting the value of this input element? So we are getting this button, but somehow this one is not getting this. Oh, do we have to give it a value attribute? John, hi. So even this one doesn't show anything. Is it because okay, so it does give John, then why? So it does give hi, and why this one doesn't work? Is it because my backtick is wrong? Okay, so we do get the message. It's just that somehow it's not printing it with the backticks. Well, doesn't really matter. What matters is we do get the name and message. So what we do, of course, is we send this name and message to the server side. And URL in this case is add comment. And if we look at add comment, so doGet will forward to a JSP page, and we don't need that anymore. And the do post will get a name parameter, a message parameter inserted into the database, and so that is good. And again, it's the send redirect, which we don't need. Now, however, we do want the ID of the new entry, so that means we'll get so add entry, I believe, returns the ID. Yeah, so add entry returns the ID of the newly created entry. So we'll get the ID here, and we'll do something similar to the servlet in the previous example. We'll simply send back the ID as plain text, and we'll send back the ID like this. Okay, so this is our server-side controller. Again, very similar to the old one, except that it no longer returns a view because we are working with AJAX operations and it's the same page. So all it does is send back a ID value. Now on this side, the data here will be name and message. And if it's successful, we'll get the ID back. And what we do is we need to create a new row. So we'll say this is a new row, and this new row will be a TD. And in this case, let's use that backtick again. And this one will have a data entry ID of this one. And this row will append a TD, which has the name. And this row will append a TD, which has the message. And this one will append another button called delete in a TD, something like this. Well, let's see if this thing works. We'll save and we'll refresh, and we'll say John says hi. And by default it's sending it as get parameters. So that means we should use method, and we should say host. Let's refresh and try again. Let's say John and hi. So it does insert it into the database, but it's not creating a new row here. Oh, that's because I forgot to insert the new row into the table. So we'll need to append this thing into the table. And in particular, we need to append it before the last row, which is the form row. And this is why I had the ID for this row. So we can pick this row, and we can say let's insert the new row before it. And let's run this again, and we'll say Jane says hello. Okay, so it adds a row. It looks somewhat weird. And this is we look at here. Oh, so we have the data entry thing here, but we don't have the value. We do have TD, 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 and also we have the TR. It should be a TD. It should be a TR. Okay, so that's why. And the data should be like this. Let's try it one more time. And then Tom says, I like your site. Okay, so now it kind of works. And yeah, so this is, and we can set this one to empty after success. So we can say do all this, and so once we are done, we will set name value to empty string and message field to empty string so that it doesn't stay there. So refresh, try one more time, and Jack says hi. Okay, so now the form is cleared, and if we look at the database, all this stuff is in here. So I'm going to stop here. It's not a particularly complex example, but I hope it shows all the basics about AJAX operations, event handler, background request to server send back response, callback function process a response, update the HTML page, and all that. Okay, so this is the end of the video, and in fact, this is the end of the whole. This is the end of the lectures for the class. So hope you enjoyed the class and learned something from it. All right, that is it.